In the early 1960s, when my doctor said I only had months to live, there were still photo projects I wanted to do, like documenting the unionization of migrant workers in California, or creating a full-scale photo documentary of people in America's largest cities. But if you want to know the truth, my real passion was to produce portraits of all my children and grandchildren. I had neglected them terribly while traveling all those years for the government and magazine assignments and while writing books with my husband, Paul Taylor. Looking back, it still makes me sad. None of those projects was ever completed. Instead, like all artists with big egos, I jumped at the chance to work with a major museum to mount a retrospective of my life's work. What artist wouldn't do that? But to tell the truth, I had mixed feelings about the project from the start. On the one hand, it would cement my reputation as an artist, particularly a woman artist. But on the other hand, the amount of work involved just might kill me. Nevertheless, in 1964, when John Sarkowski, director of photography at the Museum of Modern Art, called me about the retrospective, I said yes, against my better judgment, and the advice of my husband, Paul Taylor. How could I refuse? It would be a great honor. Only 4 photographers ever had a retrospective at the MoMA: Walker Evans, Henri Cartier-Bresson, Paul Strand, and Edward Weston. This show would put me in the company of those great artists, and I would be the first woman. So over the next 2 years, I devoted myself to assisting Mr. Sarkowski, going through the huge file of Depression-era photos I hadn't seen in decades, and agonizing over selections. Even though I exhausted nearly all my remaining energy, I must tell you, the work was pure joy. Those images created in me the most intense feelings. I recalled all the miles in the car across the West, the South, and America's drought and wind-wasted heartland, the hundreds of stops at migrant camps, country stores, and sharecroppers' shacks, the barefoot mothers and their children, the painfully brief visits with those dignified middle-class families walking the roads in search of work, carrying suitcases or pushing carts filled with their belongings, all the images of needy people and their children. People ask me how I coped with those feelings. There are 2 answers to that question. Every time I pressed the shutter and smiled in gratitude at those penniless families, it helped me to think of myself as a social scientist, an observer of people. You see, Paul and I had written a book about the migrants from the Dust Bowl called An American Exodus. Paul was a University of California economist and taught me how to make objective and accurate captions of my photographs, sometimes using a subject's own words. We were dedicated to documenting the great erosion of people from America's Dust Bowl. But academic objectivity only went so far. The other way I coped with the human tragedy I saw every day was to make sure I captured the authentic heartbreak in the faces. Only a photographer with a pure soul can do that. A photographer without guile or cunning, who wishes only to capture the truth. And what is the truth? The truth is, no matter how destitute people look, you must capture their dignity. Two events shaped my life. Childhood polio left me with a partially paralyzed leg and a damnable limp, something that tormented me the rest of my life. I have to say, Polio was the most important thing that happened to me. It formed me, guided me, instructed me, and humiliated me. All those things at once, and I never got over it. The second event was my father's desertion. A successful attorney, Henry Newtshorn, abandoned our family without explanation, and my mother, determined to put his betrayal behind her, changed the family name to her maiden name of Lange. Finding work as a librarian in Manhattan's Lower East Side, Mother easily supported my brother and me with the library's generous salary. In 1895, the year I was born, Jacob Riis, a Danish-American social reformer and muckraking reporter, published images of the desperate poverty of New York's Lower East Side in a book he called How the Other Half Lives. Now, right smack in the middle of all that squalor was Public School 62. Every day I walked to class past destitute men and women sitting on stoops, looking at me in my clean clothes and tidy books tucked under my arm. The families of the kids at PS 62 were ambitious, hard-working immigrants who couldn't wait to leave the slums and move uptown. Later on, at Manhattan's elite Wadley High School for Girls, I found I didn't fit in with the other students and had no interest in marrying a rich man and becoming a society matron. Instead, I was drawn back to the slums because I found them more interesting. Even back then, it was clear I had a stubborn streak of liberalism. My friend Florence Alstrom enjoyed walking with me. We'd cut classes and poke around the Bowery just to experience the noisy crowds and the rich diversity of immigrant life. On those walks, there were times I wished I had a camera and could tell the story of these people with photographs. After graduating from high school, I wanted to learn the basics of photography, so from a string of lovable hacks, I took jobs in several New York photo labs, learning the techniques of negative developing, printing, and retouching. I also absorbed lessons of portrait photography, including posings, set design, and lighting. Eventually, I felt I needed more formal training, so I enrolled with Clarence White at Columbia University. Now, he was a great teacher and knew his stuff, but he had us shooting architecture and graphic design when all I wanted was to photograph people. With White's blessing, I left his class early, bought a large camera and 2 lenses, and began taking portraits of my family. I had learned that formal schooling will only teach you so much. No one can show you how to photograph a person's soul. But good photographers can do that, and it has nothing to do with technique. It's simply a connection you make with people so they feel your respect. Only then will they trust you enough to reveal themselves to you. In the best portraits, you will see that connection. In January 1918, when I was 23, Florence and I boarded a steamship in Hoboken and set off for what we hoped would be a grand adventure around the world. Our first stop was New Orleans, where we caught a train for San Francisco. Our plan was simple. When our initial money ran out, I would work in a photo lab while Florence worked as a telegrapher for Western Union. She was so good, they promised her work in any Western Union office in the world. With funds restored, off we'd go again. But in San Francisco, we hit a snag. A pickpocket robbed us of all our money, forcing us to start over. But it turned out this bad break was lucky for me. I found a job retouching portrait photos in a local lab and was so good, the owner helped me start my own photography business. In 1919, I opened my own studio on Sutter Street next to a fashionable art gallery and almost immediately became successful making portraits of wealthy Jewish families who were big patrons of the San Francisco art community. I was soon a financial success and well known among the photographic elites of San Francisco, including Ansel Adams and Imogene Cunningham. One day, I was in the basement darkroom of my studio on Sutter when I heard the distinctive clumping of cowboy boots above me. I climbed the stairs to see a tall, middle-aged man in tooled leather boots, a three-piece suit, a black felt cowboy hat, and carrying a gold-headed cane. As I approached him, he was busy examining my portraits, and without looking up, he asked, "This your work?" The man had the aloof aspect of a bird of prey with a hatchet nose and a narrow face. He gave me to feel I should know him, or at least know of him. He kept his distance by leaning away from me on the cane and appraising my work with pursed lips. "Name's Dorothea Lange. And you are?" There was an awkward pause before he answered. "Maynard Dixon," he snapped, and fixed on my eyes with contempt. Our love affair started the way most of the romance novels say they do, with the two lovers having a nasty first encounter as a cover for their mutual attraction. I married Maynard in 1920, and for 15 years we struggled as two artists frequently do, with clashing egos and conflicts over mundane domestic responsibilities. We had 2 sons, Daniel and John. I was an attentive mother, but must admit I dragged my unwilling kids with me on photo assignments. They spent a lot of time waiting for me in the back seat of a car. Maynard spent most of his time with other women and his circle of bohemian artists. He became a well-known local dandy and a renowned paint artist of the Southwest. But in 1935, I couldn't stand his womanizing anymore and got a divorce. A lot changed after the 1929 Wall Street crash. But you should understand the effects of the Depression were gradual. There wasn't this big, all-at-once disruption in the whole economy. By 1933, I was starting to feel an economic impact on my business. I was angry I had to lower my standards, like mounting portraits on plain white boards instead of on that wonderful handmade Japanese rag paper with decal edges. I was now also 38 years old and getting restless. A successful business gave me time to think about my career as a portrait photographer. Was that what I wanted, or had it simply been the expedient thing to do when I married and had children? Maynard was free to come and go, but I was trapped in the conventional role of wife and mother. Always independent as a child and young adult, I wanted to move my art beyond making portraits of San Francisco elites. Success with the wealthy had led to my isolation from the middle-class values I had absorbed in New York. I remember one day after school, I strolled from 100th Street to the Battery, taking in the sounds, sights, and smells, the perfumed matrons with their furs, the sour odor of destitute men sleeping in the doorways, and the grubby children shouting to each other, playing stickball and hanging from streetcars. There it was, life in all its diversity. As a teenager, I had been thrilled to take it all in and to think someday I might take pictures of it. In those contemplative moments, I realized how far I had strayed from my values. From my San Francisco studio window, the sight of unemployed men smoking and loitering in small groups on the street made me aware of how woefully ignorant I was of California's social problems. I simply had to get out of my studio and make a connection again with people. The only way to do that was to get back on the street with my camera and see with my own eyes how the Great Depression had changed my city. As with a lot of my big decisions, I trusted my feelings and simply jumped in. As I entered the rough world of the city streets, an anxious chill running up my back quickly vanished the first time I looked through the viewfinder and clicked the shutter. In an area not far from the studio, I made my first photographs of people impoverished by the Depression. It feels strange to say after all my years taking pictures, but that day in San Francisco was the first time I had ever been on the street with a camera. I remember an interview in 1964 with the Smithsonian where I said that first day taking street pictures changed my life. I was excited, but friends warned me. They said, "Don't go there, it's too dangerous." But I ignored them. I remember a rich woman they called the White Angel ran a bread line. That morning, as the men queued up for a handout, I took one of my most famous photographs, an old man with a tin cup. I just saw the shot and snapped it. Back home, I put his picture on my studio wall. It wasn't until months later I noticed a man in the background with a white mustache looking directly at me. He was clean and well-dressed and made for a strong contrast with the man and his cup. For me, the image of the two men summed up the Great Depression. For months, I struggled with what those photographs meant to me. My portrait customers would come in, glance at my little gallery of street photos, and ask, "What are you going to do with this kind of thing? What do you want to do this for?" That was a question I couldn't answer. I didn't know. I knew I wanted to earn a living. Put it that way, I was married, I had 2 children, and I could have stayed home. But I felt differently. I wanted to be independent and earn money. So that was the question. How could I make it all work? Sometimes it's just luck that makes a choice for you. For me, it was a chance encounter with politics. During the height of the Great Depression, the American public became deaf to the promises of politicians in Washington. The public craved immediate action to relieve the spreading economic collapse. Stalinist Russia showed outward signs of progress with its massive industrial building programs and seemed to be the alternative to America's failed capitalism. Communist political cells proliferated in the United States and elsewhere around the globe. Social and union agitation was in the air. Politicians were fearful communism would take over America. Well, it's true there were communist demonstrations going on and a good deal of social ferment. The Communist May Day celebration came along, and I heard there was going to be a big demonstration. More confident now, carrying a camera on the street, I thought I'd better go see what people wanted. I set a goal. I would go there, photograph this thing, come back and develop it. I would print it and put it on the wall, all within 24 hours. Once my photographs of the labor demonstration appeared in major publications and in Washington, D.C., a friend contacted Survey Graphic. This was a social welfare magazine, more concerned with settlement houses and social welfare problems, not political commentary so much. Someone at the magazine bought one of my demonstration photographs and printed it full page. The photo showed a street speaker talking into an old-fashioned microphone. It's still printed occasionally. Underneath the photo, they printed the slogan, "Workers of the world, unite." That caption was no favor to me, but that's what they did. Made me a communist overnight. Luckily, a professor at the University of California who wrote the article accompanying that picture telephoned me. He had a grant from the state to investigate agricultural labor, and if I could do field work, he could use my photographs as visual support for his articles. He couldn't get me hired as a photographer, so I took a job as stenographer. We made several field trips where I took notes and shot photographs of what the professor and his crew were investigating. This was the first time I saw how trained people operated. The leader of the team was Paul Taylor, who would become my second husband. Once Paul's report was filed in Washington, the connection was made with Rexford Tugwell of the Resettlement Administration and with Roy Stryker, head of its historical division. In 1935, Stryker asked me to join his photography section. Once on the team, I lobbied him hard for an assignment to Southern California's Imperial Valley. I convinced him the valley was a flashpoint for labor unrest. The daily surge of Dust Bowl families into this region created an enormous labor and housing crisis. Harvesting peas and lettuce didn't provide enough work to sustain these families, and wages were so low they couldn't meet basic needs. But migrants poured in anyway. On arrival, they sought immediate shelter in temporary government camps constructed near the harvest. But these camps filled quickly, forcing many families to live in their cars or camp in the open. Local officials were hostile, fearing such concentration of workers would lead to violence, unionization, demands for higher wages, and even communism. Local sheriffs looked the other way as thugs hired by the growers attacked the camps, beat up, and killed suspected agitators. In those brutal assaults, women and children also died. At first, it was hard for me to understand why growers would beat up people who harvested their crops. Then I realized the growers feared the tremendous surplus of labor would drive down wages and create conflict unless the growers asserted their dominance. Stryker sent Paul and me into the Imperial Valley, me as photographer and Paul as note-taker and bodyguard. But there really was no danger to us. I had a way of putting people at ease almost immediately. You know, so often it's just sticking around and being there, not just swooping in and swooping out in a cloud of dust. I sat on the ground with people and let the children handle the camera with their grimy little hands and put their fingers on the lens. And you let them because you know if you behave in a generous manner, you're apt to receive it. Here's a good example of the way I worked. I would shoot a sequence of images designed to tell a story. Take, for example, the photographs of my visit to one such migrant camp in California. The day I arrived in this temporary government camp for migratory workers set up near Brawley in California's Imperial Valley, there was a sense of organization with neat rows of tents and smoking campfires, indicating food had been cooked and consumed. There was a bathhouse and laundry off to the side. As I walked in, the well-ordered appearance of the camp at first gave me an optimistic feeling. But this gave way to an anxious butterfly sensation as I got closer to the tents, not knowing how people would react to someone from the government. My worst fear was getting shot. Each family dwelling consisted of a raised platform with a wooden skeletal frame, covered by canvas with no windows, no light or air except through the front and back flaps. As I approached one of these tents, a flap was pulled back, revealing an older man. I introduced myself and said I'm from the government, that Mr. Roosevelt had sent me. Without waiting for a response, I asked about the harvest, where they came from, what happened to the kids during the day. Do they go to school? As I'm going on with my usual chatter, the mother appeared at the opening with a large family now visible inside. There's more conversation, and the father emerged carrying his youngest son. I can hear murmuring inside. Then the entire family's out. Immediately I'm drawn to the mother's sullen expression and take a shot of her with father. I can tell all's not right between them. I think maybe I can find out what's wrong. After photographing the family, I sat in my car and wrote down everything using as much as possible the family's own words. Here's my caption from the Brawley visit. Brawley, California, Imperial Valley, 1939 in a Farm Security Administration migratory labor camp. Family of mother, father, and 11 children originally from Oklahoma, where he had been a tenant farmer. Came to California in 1936 after the drought. Since then, family's been traveling from crop to crop following the harvest. 6 of the 11 children attend school whenever the family stops long enough. 5 older children got work in the fields along with father and mother. February 23rd, 2 of the family are lucky. Get a day's work picking peas on the Sinclair Ranch. Father earned about $1.73 for a 10-hour day. Oldest daughter earned $1.25. From this, they must pay for transportation to the fields 20 miles away. Mother wants to return to Oklahoma, father unwilling. She says, "I want to go back where we can live happily, live decent, and grow what we eat." He says, "We can't go back the way I am now. We got nothing in the world to farm with. I made my mistake when I came out here." My driver, Mr. Partridge, and I logged thousands of miles over roads heading west from the Dust Bowl and north and south across the Imperial Valley. Every day we saw families walking the roads, pushing carts filled with belongings and young children. Mothers carried infants on their hips. As the sun set, families moved off the road to camp. Before sunrise, they began another day on the endless road, often with aching stomachs. It was a dangerous life. The rural highway exposed them to attack from other vagrants looking for food or cash. Women walked the roads, but almost always in the company of a man who could offer protection in return for sexual favors. Women bore the responsibility for the unwanted infants, as most of the fathers would simply run off. Camping on roadside exposed families to middle-of-the-night attacks by thugs hired by local growers who thought these vagrants were the scum of the earth. The growers hoped news of the attacks would get out and discourage others from entering the Imperial Valley. What astonished me was many of the drifters, while penniless, didn't wear rags. Some of my photos clearly show mothers well turned out in simple dresses, sweaters, and skirts. There were men in 3-piece suits and a fedora. The clothing and suitcases made them appear middle class. I wondered if photos of middle-class vagrants would arouse more sympathy in congressmen. So I made the decision to photograph the families to preserve their dignity, shooting them from a low angle, so they looked down on me. Men walking in small groups or alone were called hobos or bindle stiffs. They carried everything they owned in small sacks over their shoulders. Even though they were social outcasts, these men were critical to the harvest in California. Depending on the crops, they'd walk from farm to farm looking for picking jobs. Abuse was common. The men knew not to camp together in large groups because the growers' henchmen would bloody them and drive them off. For safety, hobos generally walked alone or in pairs to attract minimal attention. Mr. Partridge often got impatient with my wanting to stop the car so often to speak to the families and to the single men. But I must say these conversations on the side of the road were priceless, so I made sure they got into the captions. But what those captions failed to reveal is how it felt first to learn so much personal information about these families, then simply to drive off in a cloud of dust. In my opinion, women do such a better job talking to people than do men. The mothers and even the single men would tell me their whole life stories in the first 5 minutes. So in many ways, I made a unique contribution simply by being female. That pleased me more than I can tell you. Looking back on them now, I wonder what these photographs could possibly mean to someone who wasn't there, who never heard the voices of the parents and their kids. And years from now, would anyone care? Migrant Mother. The most iconic photograph of the Great Depression was almost never taken. At the end of a long day photographing migrant workers, I was satisfied with my work. All on my own, I had spent a month photographing and had plenty of negatives. The sun was low and it was rainy and cold. Facing 7 more hours of driving before I made it home, I was completely exhausted. Driving along US 101 in February 1936, I spotted a migrant camp near Nipomo, about 2 hours north of Santa Barbara. A small hand-lettered sign said Pea Pickers Camp. I drove on beyond it for about 20 miles until I started to have an argument with myself. Dorothea, what's going on in that camp back there? What's the situation? Nobody would ask this of you now. Don't you have plenty of negatives already on the subject, and isn't this just one more of the same? Besides, you take a camera out in this rain, you'll be asking for trouble. I turned around. After driving into the camp, I learned a freeze had killed the peas, so there was no work. I spotted a woman and her children in a lean-to. The woman was Florence Thompson, whose image would be immortalized in my photo of the migrant mother. Thompson's grandson recalled the day I pulled up in the car. The look of hunger was in the camp. Within a week, death would be there too. First, the very young and the very old. Soon the locals would descend on the camp, arresting some and beating others, scattering all to the 4 winds. Thompson told me her family ate birds the children killed and frozen vegetables stolen from the fields. 32 at the time I arrived. Thompson, like most women on the road during the Great Depression, needed to attach to a man for protection and sustenance. With no contraceptives, women had many children, sometimes with several so-called husbands. Thompson had 11 children by 3 such men. Some of the children, weakened by malnutrition, had died. When I arrived, Thompson's current man was off trying to get the car repaired. Tired and cold, I cut short my usual warm-up banter and quickly identified myself as from the government and began to pose mother and children. They were all so listless from hunger. They complied easily with my every request. I shot 4 photos before I finally positioned mother and 2 children the way I wanted. I moved dirty laundry out of the way and eliminated the oldest daughter from the final photograph. I knew from experience small children would make the image more poignant. The final photo showed 2 daughters turned away from the camera but leaning on mother, a swaddled baby in Thompson's lap. People ask if I intentionally posed the mother with hand on her cheek. Yes, I admit this gesture was not spontaneous, and purists, I know, will object. But I sensed the mother and children were tiring rapidly, and I wanted some way to convey the mother's dignity. It was a spur-of-the-moment decision. Driving away devastated me. I knew the final photo composition was excellent, but I couldn't shake the feeling I had exploited the mother with that hand gesture and all my fussing about with the kids in the laundry. Was the photo the truth or my truth? I cried all the way home, fretting about it. Many times I had posed people in the studio and in the migrant camps with a gesture just like that. It was my signature. But was it the right thing to do? The migrant mother experience became a cautionary tale about how much the artist should affect the subject of the photograph. I suppose it's impossible not to, but from that moment on, every time I snapped the shutter, I thought about it. In the end, it was clear to me the more a subject grabs my emotions, the more I am pulled in and liable to shade the truth for my own purposes. Photography, after all, is a conscious act of selection, not a passive recording. In a good photograph, you should always feel the presence of the artist. When I returned to Berkeley and developed the negatives, I knew I had some special photos. I sent the Thompson prints to the editor of the San Francisco News, who published 2 of them, and $200,000 in contributions to help Nipomo's destitute migrants quickly flowed into the newspaper. Florence Thompson became the icon of the Great Depression, and my guilt was partly relieved. Late in my career, I had one last chance to confront the question of what is propaganda and what is truth. 2 months after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Franklin Roosevelt signed an executive order requiring the military to send to internment camps anyone perceived as a threat. The president's order didn't mention Japanese Americans, but local authorities freely interpreted the order to unleash their pent-up racism. In San Francisco, any person with at least one 64th Japanese ancestry was sent to the camps. Roosevelt's order also became an open invitation to loot and sell the homes and businesses of Japanese Americans. These local regulations bore striking similarities to the racial Nuremberg laws used to oppress Germany's Jews. The War Relocation Authority assigned me to photograph the transfer of families from San Francisco to the Manzanar camp in the Sierra Nevada mountains. The camps, hastily built tar paper shacks, were freezing in winter and stifling in summer. The evacuees received minimal rations and protective clothing. Fences of barbed wire surrounded the camp, and people trying to escape received 2 orders to halt before guards shot them. Army escorts also controlled where I went. They wanted me simply to document fair treatment, but they couldn't control the story I wanted to tell. Just look at the grandparents, kids, mothers, and fathers, all tagged and ready for shipment. This was gross injustice. American style. These families had made a decent life for themselves, had deep attachments to American culture and to their community. They had businesses, celebrated American holidays, flown the American flag, and donated money to American causes. But after the racial feeding frenzy in San Francisco had run its course, they knew there would be nothing to come home to. Every bit of me was ready for this assignment, and my blood was up. I would not simply record. I would tell an unabashed story of American injustice. Here I was, a tired old woman on her final project, lugging a heavy camera, intending to capture the heartbreak of these beautiful people. If there was ever a chance for me to put my core feelings into my work, this was it. I had devoted my entire professional life to capturing the humanity of my subjects and to preserving their dignity. I had shot them all, from fancy studio portraits of bored society matrons to hurried photos of desperate migrants huddled in the rain under a flimsy lean-to while I stood in the mud with a camera. And over the years, working for the government, I had shocked everyone with the truth of what Americans could do to each other. From the brutal and deadly suppression of migrant pea pickers, to the scorn of Negroes in the South, to the racist prison at Manzanar, American injustice found its clearest voice in a contempt for its own people. My relocation photographs were never published in my lifetime because the Army thought them too inflammatory. They impounded the whole lot for 30 years. It's easy to understand why. The army had wanted propaganda, but I wanted the truth, at least my version of it. But the photographs were published in 1972 when my Japanese-American relocation images appeared in a traveling show. This was the first time Americans became aware of this egregious wrong to our minority citizens and were forced to look them in the eye. After the war, my health declined further. I spent much of my time at home, with many visits to the hospital to deal with abdominal pain. Even though my doctors told me I had terminal cancer of the esophagus, I was determined to live as normally as possible. I willed myself to have the energy to make trips to Asia, Egypt, and South America with Paul, and to Ireland with my son Daniel. I managed to collaborate on several magazine articles, confer with Edward Steichen on the Family of Man exhibit, film an interview with San Francisco Educational Television, and teach photography classes at the University of California. But before long, even the simplest task exhausted me. When John Sarkowski, curator of photography at the Museum of Modern Art, asked me to do the retrospective, I put all my remaining energy into helping him select and organize the photographs. My retrospective opened January 26, 1966. I didn't see it. I died October 11th, 1965, surrounded by Paul and all my children and grandchildren. I must tell you, there were exhausting days when I felt uninspired and defeated by the long miles and the endless repetition of camps and destitute people. And despite all the recognition I received during my lifetime and all the thousands of photos I shot, only 2 stand out. Think of it. Only 2 images from thousands of negatives and countless miles in the dusty heat and freezing cold. But you can't judge a life that way. Ask me now, and I'll tell you it was worth the trouble. Why? Because the search for truth is important, whether you find it or not, and I'm proud there were times I came pretty close.